that after Adam, it's a hard act to follow. So pardon me, because it'll be not as entertaining and as informative as Adam was, obviously. Anyway, good morning, everyone. What I wanted to talk to you about today is a practical approach. I mean, there is a lot of buzz going around in digitization. I'm sure you're all part of it, whether it's blockchain, AI, ML, etc. This is something that I wanted to share with you, which is a real-life experience I've had a few times in my career. So just before I get into the meat of it, I wanted to give you an idea of, just to introduce myself. I've been really fortunate to work for some of the best companies around the world. And you can see some of the names that you hopefully will recognize there. Starting off with Unilever, straight after school, I've had the opportunity to not only work for the best companies, but also on the 4 continents. I've learned from the best, and this is something that I wanted to share with you today to give you a practical viewpoint and hopefully some kind of guidance of how to digitize your own supply chains. So I think the first thing that I wanted to talk about is, having spent the last 6-7 years in the pharma industry, I come from consumer but migrated into pharma. And just to share a little bit of myself, I went into pharma to give back. Because as I said, I'd learned from the best, and I think for me at least, and supply chain, if getting the drug to a patient at the right time, in the right way, is probably the most satisfying thing that a supply chain person can have. So for me, it was more like to give back to the, for all the things that I had received around the world and with the various companies. So what I wanted to share with you is an example from the pharma industry. And how many of you are in the life sciences space? Well, we have a few. So you'll hopefully recognize some of the things that I'll talk about. There's one thing that I know for certain, that as the pharma industry or the life sciences industry is evolving, it's not going to be business as usual. Do you guys agree with that? To give you some examples of what's happening, people who are not part of the life sciences industry, one is the digitization of medical records. Now, that sounds pretty straightforward, but if you really look at the impact that's going to have or is starting to have, how many of you have actually seen a book called The Patient Will See You Now? If not, I would, it's a very interesting book. Basically, the whole table around the healthcare, is actually changing, where the patients have much more say and control through social media, through all kinds of other things. Because I can tell you, a wrong prescription or a wrong event in the healthcare space, if it gets onto the social media and goes viral, can you imagine the PR issue that the company or the healthcare provider will have? So I think that's changing how we deliver service or products to either the providers or to the patients. Second, I think if you look at the regulatory compliance, is becoming much stricter. Again, from a supply chain perspective, what does that really mean? The people who are in that space will probably relate to this. If your competitor gets a warning letter from FDA, they have to withdraw the product. And guess what? Your demand spikes. On the opposite side, some supplier somewhere in the world supplying you some very critical components or materials gets a warning letter from another health agencies. They're out of business, and now you've got to find a second source. And people who are familiar with the life science industry, you'll know that to get an approval for a new source, it's a matter of years. This is not something that you can do very quickly. So there are many other areas. One of the other things that I think are impacting the supply chain most is most of the growth is coming from the emerging markets. Europe, US are fairly developed already, and the bulk of the business, the new business, is coming, which is extending the supply chain. To a supply chain professional, managing ingredients coming from China, being processed in India, packed somewhere else, then shipped into Egypt. I mean, can you imagine managing that supply chain and in a highly dynamic environment? The demand spikes, as I talked about, from regulatory and other issues and supply variability, managing longer supply chains becoming a challenge. So overall, hopefully that gives you an idea of what that is going to mean. Now, in my own experience, we tried to do a functional approach to say, okay, fine, we'll try and figure out in supply chain of how we're going to manage this. But my key learning was that you actually need a business response. And what I mean by that is, it's about total solutions. And that's a phrase that I try and live to in my own. Don't give a partial response or a partial solution. So if you take, for example, demand variability, which I think all of us deal with as supply chain leaders, we can't fix it. We can only deal with it, we can respond to it, but you can't really fix the demand variability. Now what you need to do is to work with the procurement and other organizations' operations to build some kind of a quick response mechanism, because you being able to plan faster is not going to help that. So what you basically require is a business response, not just a functional view. Because if you just do a functional view, you're going to maybe optimize, or to use Paul's term today, synchronize it, but the rest of the business may not be able to support that kind of synchronization, and it will fall apart. So what you need to do is, if you really look at supply chain, touches every element of a business. If you think about from a research development to operations to finance to quality or whatever it might be. So what you need to do is to look at the business holistically, and then basically there are a few questions. And again, there are no right or only or cookie-cutter ways of doing this. But some of the things that I would recommend is use this as a top-down approach. And when I mean top-down is, talk to the senior executives of the company. Say, given that our landscape is changing so rapidly, what is going to be the space for this company? Are we going to lead in innovation, lead in service? What is going to be the value proposition of the company? Now, it sounds very, 50,000 feet cloud, but really you need to start because you're now building for the future. You're not responding to something that's a problem today because it won't happen that way. So you start from the space that the company wants to do. Look at how you can, as supply chain leaders, bring value to that proposition of the company. Look at what your capabilities that you will require. So it's a cascaded approach. I'll talk a little more about capabilities and what I mean by that. What capabilities would you need as a supply chain, some you have, some you don't have, to really be able to support that kind of strategic intent of the company? And then start looking at how you're going to build it. And based on those capabilities, what you need to look at is look at a new operating model. I'll give you a real-life example later on, but basically my personal experience has been that because this business is not going to be the way we've seen it in the past, you'll need to look at new operating models going forward. For me, the first thing, and I'll reiterate some of the things that were said in the morning, we talk a lot about AI, ML, etc., but people are indispensable. Creativity of people, which it's something that I strongly believe in, and the success of any transformation is having the right people, and most importantly, the right culture. One of the things that I believe in as leaders, that we are responsible for 3 C's. First is the culture, second, capabilities, and the third, capacity. That's the real work of a leader. Forget about all the expertise that you bring to the table. So you need to make sure you have the right culture, you have the right capabilities in the teams, and you have the right capacity, means you have adequate resources. So think about that as you're building your operating model for the people side, and it's in the sequence that I'm trying to show it to you. The second is process and systems. I've heard from many of you now and even before, we have a major problem in the supply chain. Okay, let's go find a technology solution, and that will fix it. It's not like going into a Walmart and buying a piece of chocolate. There is a lot of pre-work required before you get to a point of the technology. So first the people operating model, then the process and systems, and here system means work systems, not IT systems I'm talking about. For me, number 3 is the technology. Based on the capabilities, the culture, and everything else that you work through in the first 2 boxes, you then look for the right fit of the technology. And that is something very, very important. I mean, yesterday I was talking at another session, and I said, you have to take your time in these areas, because for me, it's like courtship. And if you don't take enough time and make sure that you're doing it right, and if you either propose or get married, you got to live with that system for a long, long time to come. So take your time, because I find a lot of companies, they rush into a technology solution, or it's predetermined. Oh, we are an SAP shop, so we'll just take APO. No, I mean, APO may or may not be the proper thing to do. So you have to follow a very pragmatic, logical, and a cascaded approach is what my recommendation would be to you. Last but not the least, many of us forget this. And I can tell you, I have personally learned it the hard way. We did everything right in the first 3 boxes, didn't pay attention to the data, and the go live was a disaster. Because as you've heard, and I'm sure you know as well as I do, garbage in, garbage out. So we tend to forget that having clean data, whether it's master data or properly structured transactional data, none of this transformation is going to work. The most critical, this actually I'm showing here is an SCM World Leader. Last year, they have done a survey. In going through a supply chain or even a business transformation, what was the biggest problem that the leaders faced? And to some of you, it may be surprising. It's not about direction from leadership. It's not about use case, et cetera, what you see there. But it was the lack of a roadmap. And believe it or not, I think it's absolutely right. Because what you need to do is actually rethink the whole supply chain strategy. As I said, a new operating model with a good roadmap. What you need to really think about is it's not going to be a quick fix. This is not something, oh, I have a demand problem or a supply problem, I'll fix it. The industry is really evolving, and otherwise you'll just be chasing your tail, because you'll just be responding to the immediate symptoms that you're seeing out there. To do it properly and permanently, you need to really step back and take a long-term approach. And for that, you need a roadmap. So I'll walk you through some of the things that we had gone through in a couple of the companies that I've tried, I've actually implemented this. And this is a particular example from a pharma company. The first thing we did was, you looked at the industry trends, but you look at the company trends. So one of the companies I worked for, I'll give you some of the things that were happening in the company. When I joined the company 4 years ago, they were a $5 or $6 billion enterprise, primarily generics. That was 2014. 2018, $12 billion. They got biosimilars, they got over-the-counters, they've got branded generics, they got all kinds. Europe, when I went to Dublin 4 years ago, was a $1 billion business. Today, it's touching $4.5 billion. Phenomenal growth, not just in size, but in complexity. Emerging markets went from $500 million to $2.5 billion in the same period. So not dealing with just the complexity of 35 countries in Europe, dealing with 61 countries in the rest of the world, as we called it, and all kinds of issues that come with it. We actually projected that back in 2014 and 15, that the company, going back to the company vision and how you're going to differentiate themselves, was by having explosive growth, both organic and inorganic. The other thing is the new products I mentioned. If you look at a biosimilar, an oncology drug, it's very different from a normal generic product. It is not sold to wholesalers. It doesn't go to a pharmacy. It goes to an oncologist or a clinic or a patient at times, because if you're in a home care. So now you're looking at multiple go-to-market models. You're looking at multiple distribution channels, etc. So predicting those kind of things 3 years in advance, because the biosimilar being launched right now as we speak in Europe. You can't build the capabilities to handle that now. You should have started a few years ago. So it's important for you to really look at where your business is going, what is going to be the implication of that on the supply chain. Some of the things that actually was analyzed at that time was, one is the high M&A activity, because they were going to grow inorganically as well. So we needed to build capabilities for M&A, so be able to integrate businesses very quickly, because that's the only way you can get value. Demand and supply volatility, we talked about, that's an industry phenomenon. Another thing was you're into tender market business, and tenders, when you win them, there is a demand spike. When you lose them, now you have an extra inventory lying with you. Attribute-based planning, and that probably the people in pharma would actually appreciate more what I'm talking about, is because of the volatility of supply side particularly, you have to do risk management. And you have to have dual or triple sources for materials. But a material, especially the active ingredients that we use in drugs, that if it is not registered in a market, you can't ship it even though it may be an identical product. So you need to have a full visibility and actually a control over this particular active ingredient can only be sold in those markets, etc. And if you make a mistake, it leads to a recall, even though the product is perfectly fine. So that's another key requirement that we knew, especially when it comes into biotech and biosimilars. Cost to serve control, as you know, all governments are targeting drug prices. You can hear it on the news everywhere in the world. That's the easiest for them, a place to go to reduce the healthcare costs. So we need to really bring down the cost, which is pretty obvious. Extended supply chain, be able to ship to Libya a biosimilar product, temperature control 2 to 8, and to be able to manage that kind of extended value chain. The other thing which we had to be careful about, we actually did an analysis as a team. How long does it really take to bring a product from absolute start materials to delivery to the customer? And it shocked my entire executive team, 354 days. Some of you may be familiar with what I'm talking about. No one realized it because everyone looked at their own little lead times. But if you start from the materials imported from someplace in the world, start making the active ingredients, then the bulk, then tablets or whatever the case might be. What we needed to do is to have a much wider, a longer visibility and connected enterprise to be able to manage those kind of lead times. Because if there is a variability at the front end, you should have handled that 354 days ahead. Now, I'm not saying that's always possible, but you can imagine what will be required as we go forward. Multiple go-to-market models. As I said, we have over-the-counter, which goes to different outlets. We have generics, which goes to pharmacy. Oncology goes to hospitals or clinics. And then the multi-channel distribution. So here are some of the impacts that we worked out on. And one thing that me and my team realized, that we have to think different. And a simple thing I'll say, leading a global supply chain, very, very small things matter. I mean, I was talking to the team, at one time, and I said, okay, you're booking a conference call. Do you realize it's 2 a.m. in Japan at that time? So having a global mindset is something which was very, very important if you really want to run a global enterprise. You need to worry about cultures. You need to worry about how you interact with people, because you are dealing with human beings and not with robots. Then the other thing that was really important is we needed to really think about the future and build for the future. Because the instant reaction of a lot of my team actually was, okay, so we'll fix this problem in 6 months. No, this is going to be a journey, and we're going to do it logically. And look at, stand back and look at the world as it's evolving and develop a total solution around that. Going through a very detailed exercise, here are some of the capabilities that we came about. How did we actually do this? This is not something which we whiteboarded or did, but basically looked at what is the value proposition of the supply chain, and to deliver that value proposition, what capabilities will be required. Now, I'm not going to walk you through these, but hopefully some of these will give you an idea. The idea is to talk about capabilities and not about initiatives or projects. You're building capabilities, which is a combination of people, process, technology, and data. Keep that in mind as you go forward with that. The other thing I wanted to share with you is a roadmap. Now, don't worry about trying to grasp what is written on it, but the only things I want you to notice here is it's a multi-year program. There are hundreds of initiatives out there in proper sequence, in proper channels, and you're building multiple things from ground up to reach to a point that you want to get to. Don't be in a rush. Get it right rather than get it early, would be my sincere advice. Make sure that the company and the organization understands this is not a quick fix. This is a journey which will then finally yield. Now, you get prizes on the way, so you don't have to wait for 4 years to do everything, but don't try and do it in a hurry because you won't get it right for the first time. The critical learning for me was keeping in mind a few things. One is supply chain transformations are hard. Why? Because we touch every function of the company if we do anything different. So there are cross-functional dependencies, and the most critical thing is you're driving change without being in position of power. So keep that in mind. Don't jump into it. Make sure that you have the right strategy to deal with the organizational change. Start only if you have the right talent. Way back in my career, once I stopped a transformation program, canceled the contract with the technology provider because I didn't have the right team. Because if you don't have it, you're starting off with a disaster on your hands. Talent has to be right. The other is a willing coalition. You heard a little bit about that from Adam. And most importantly, again, clean, comprehensive master data. That's the most important piece that you need to also worry about. So in conclusion, the pharma supply chain of the future will require different behaviors. Again, back to the human beings. They're not going to be actors compete as individuals. It's not going to be a relay race. It'll have to be done in a seamless cooperation across the integrated team. That's what's going to mean success in the evolving world as we digitize, move faster, et cetera, et cetera. That's all I had for today. Any questions?